Welcome to the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. Like any good marriage, we will debate, evaluate, and sometimes quarrel about how privacy and security impact business in the 21st century.
Hi, I'm Jody Daniels, and I'm the founder and CEO of Red Clover Advisors, a certified women's privacy consultancy. I'm a privacy consultant and a certified informational privacy professional, and I help provide practical privacy advice to overwhelmed companies. Today, I'm joined with my husband, Justin Daniels.
Hi, Justin Daniels here. I am a cybersecurity subject matter expert and business attorney. I am the cyber quarterback, helping clients design and implement cyber plans, as well as helping them manage and recover from the inevitable data breach. Additionally, I provide cyber business consulting services to companies.
And this episode is brought to you by Red Clover Advisors. We help companies to comply with data privacy laws and establish customer trust so that they can grow and nurture integrity. We work with companies in a variety of fields, including technology, SaaS, e-commerce, media agencies, and professional and financial services. In short, we use data privacy to transform the way companies do business. Together, we're creating a future where there is greater trust between companies and consumers. To learn more, visit redcloveradvisors.com. And today, Justin, who do we have with us?
Well, today I'm very excited because we have Marc Debrody of the United States Secret Service. He is the head of the Atlanta Cyber Fraud Task Force. And you're probably wondering, well, wait a second, why are we talking to the United States Secret Service? This is a cybersecurity and privacy podcast. I thought they protect people. Well, they do a whole lot more than that, and we're going to learn about that today. So, Marc, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Justin and Jody. Appreciate you having me on. We've been partners for, it seems like several years now in getting out and helping get out the message on engaging law enforcement and developing relationships in that area around cybersecurity. So thanks again for your partnership and the invite.
Absolutely. So Justin, now that you stole my intro, what was fun was I was talking to my mom about this interview and she said, the Secret Service? Who are they protecting? And so this is a perfect segue because so many people, including myself, I remember when I first got to have lunch with the Secret Service. It was so exciting. I didn't care anything about the content of the conference. I just thought it was super cool that I could have lunch with the Secret Service. So Marc, do explain to my mom and to others what else the Secret Service does, because it is certainly a whole lot more.
Sure. So certainly, I would say Hollywood has had a certain level of impact as to public perception of what the Secret Service does. I mean, perhaps with the exception of maybe the 1985 film, I think it was called To Live and Die in L.A. Do you remember that film? It highlighted the lengths which Secret Service agents would go to arrest a counterfeiter in L.A. With the exception of maybe that film, most people know us from the Hollywood depictions of protection. So that's not our actual mission. I mean, that's one of our missions. We were created in 1865 by President Lincoln to combat counterfeit currency problem that was actually becoming an issue during the Civil War era. The day that he created the Secret Service was the same day he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. And that terrible irony, he didn't have a protective detail, nor did we even have that mission during that time. It wasn't actually until the assassination of William McKinley that the Secret Service assumed the protective mission and therefore becoming this dual mission agency. So we are a dual mission agency with protection and investigations. And we can certainly talk about how our investigations have really morphed over the years into this cyberspace.
Well, I did not realize I was also going to have a history lesson. So I appreciate it. Every day you learn something new. So I genuinely I did not know that. So I'm super excited. What would be fascinating, I think, is to hear a little bit about some of the types of investigations that have happened over the years. And obviously now we're in the digital era and cybersecurity is such a prevalent one. What are some of the other types, kind of like by topics, that you've covered before or maybe are still a big issue?
Sure, Jody. It's been interesting in my 25 years for the Secret Service to see how our roles have really evolved over the course of that time. When I first started, counterfeit investigations were dominant, and they moved from offset printing type notes to inkjet notes created with computers and high resolution scanners and copiers. And then we saw, the proliferation of credit card fraud, skimming of credit cards by, rogue waiters or waitresses, stealing maybe 10 or 20 cards a night, to what we now have of large scale data breaches involving really millions of compromised credit cards that end up on the dark web. So criminals, I think, have realized that today's cybercrime, via things like ransomware and business email compromise, or BEC, is really financially more lucrative and offers almost a little bit greater anonymity. Just to kind of tie this together, the genesis for our kind of cyber mission really goes back to the 2001 Patriot Act signed by President George W. Bush. The legislation that was created really recognized the Secret Service is successful in establishing partnerships. And we do that in protection. We can't do our protective mission alone. It requires, local, state, and federal entities to help us carry that out. And so too in the cyber world. And so that legislation tasked us with creating electronic crimes task forces across the country. Now we're called cyber fraud task forces, or CFTFs. And we have over 40 across the United States and overseas. I'm privileged to be able to lead one here in Atlanta with over 400 local, state, federal law enforcement officers, as well as private industry and academia.
Well, thank you for all that you all are doing. It's amazing to see how many people need to be connected and a part of it. And I love that it's a public and private connection.
So, Mark, this is Justin. So I wanted to delve into a particular topic where I've personally interacted with the service, and that is, I had a client who had a business email compromise, meaning someone socially engineered an email that someone responded to, and they wired money, and it was all fraudulent. I was able to contact the Secret Service within 24 hours, and we were actually able to get back almost all the money, because when the Secret Service calls Wells Fargo's fraud department, you don't dial 6 or get put on hold. And I thought you might be able to talk to our audience a little bit about what they can expect when they engage with law enforcement around some of your capabilities, and talk a little bit about the time period you have when you're trying to get back money when we're in that wire fraud scenario from a phishing attack.
Sure. In the case of the BEC, as you mentioned, business email compromise, we're happy to assist there, in helping to recover money. Time, as you mentioned, is of essence. Generally, less than 72 hours is needed to engage that process, whether it's domestic wire or a foreign wire. In a foreign wire, anything over 72 hours of notification from that wire fraud happening cannot be engaged upon internationally. So we need 72 hours or less for that. And there's also a dollar limit on that too. But time is important, and tied to time is relationships. And back to my earlier point, if you don't know who to call, then the time just takes longer and ticks down quicker. So having that contact in the Secret Service locally ahead of time as to know who to call is extremely, extremely important. Not only just for BEC purposes, but the other topic of ransomware, where the Secret Service can come in and we might be able to help with decryption. Not all the time, but occasionally we can do that. More importantly, we can provide you with, or companies, with valuable information on attack vectors, indicators of compromise, because more than likely we've seen that ransomware variant before, and we know how the bad actors like to get into the network with certain types of executable files and how they propagate through the network and really exfiltrate data. So we can work with companies, work with IR firms to share that information to help you get back and triage the situation. We also know that you folks see a lot of noise on a daily basis. So we certainly, when I say noise, I mean there's constant phishing emails that come in. We're certainly not looking to get a phone call for every single one of them. But in general, if it's significant, a new threat or a significant event, we certainly want to hear, and we certainly are able to help with the fund recovery, as you mentioned.
So that raises an interesting question. You know, a lot of times people are confused. Who do I call and in what order? And who do I call first? And do I call the Secret Service? Do I call the FBI? Do I call the police? Do I call the State Bureau? Can you help walk through what should a company do? Who should it have on its roster and how should it order them?
Well, first, that's a great question. We always say call someone. Because we work very closely. I mean, all across our country, our offices have, I think, good relationships, even at the headquarters level. We have a great relationship with our federal partners, not just the FBI, but Homeland Security and others. And so when we get that call, there will be deconfliction locally in the background. So a victim really doesn't need to worry about, is this a case that the FBI would work or the Secret Service would work? Call someone, call the people that you have the relationship with, and we will work that in the background. Again, the important thing is to not be scrounging around when your hair's on fire to figure out when to do or who to do that with, but have those contacts and relationships built ahead of time. But to the initial question, we work hand in hand with the FBI, and if they have that case already open on something that may be being worked, we gladly, pass that information to them and vice versa.
So with that being said, when I call my closest friend in one of those places, what do I need to have ready to make sure that it's going to be a valuable call and I'm able to make the most of my time? Because as we said, it sounds like I need 72 hours, or I only have 72 hours, especially in the case of a business email compromise. What is it I need to have ready? And then who in the company should be making that call? Is there particular people who we want to have on the call? And Justin, you might have some thoughts on that too, of who I want on the call or who I don't want on the call.
Yes, dear.
Ooh, yes, dear.
Great. You got a yes dear.
I did.
So the question,
I'm sure you back to my other status soon.
So the information that you should provide, first of all, the Secret Service is looking for evidence of a crime. So when we are invited to the table for that conversation, we're going to be having a discussion with you to help us collect that information that will need to help lead to attribution, because that's our goal. Our ultimate goal is to find the bad actor, right? So we're going to look for things such as, we're going to ask for things such as email headers that may have been, the vector for the attack. We're going to look for logs, and more logs, network logs, server logs, IDS, intrusion detection systems, and IPS, prevention system logs, IP addresses. If there was any malware downloaded, we'd like to get a copy of that so we can analyze it and help further figure out where this may have gone across the network. We're going to work with your IR firm, of course, as I previously mentioned. We're going to want to know if you decided to pay ransom. And we can talk about that a little later too, but we're all about following the money, of course. So if that is done, we're going to make every attempt to follow the money. One of the other comments I'd like to make on this subject is that with regard to providing information post-breach, if one segment of your network is breached, you should assume that all segments are breached until ideally an IR firm says that your network is secure. What ends up happening is we get emails or we have communication from victims on their infected network, which oftentimes lets the bad actors know that law enforcement's now involved and they can make, counterattacks or whatever. So have out-of-band communications is important not only for internal purposes, but external as well. Regarding who, that's going to be up to the individual company. It obviously depends on the size of the agency or industry or company. We work obviously with legal counsel heavily. We work with IR firms, folks on the C-suite, so it really depends, the size of the company and who's actually engaged. Sometimes it's just one person, the CEO or whoever calling us frantic saying help, so, but ideally we like to have the phone call, have multiple people on board to include the IT folks and network folks. So, and senior leadership is important too, because when we're asking for things, having the senior leadership on that call makes it a whole lot easier to get the information that we're asking for when they grant that permission.
So, Justin, do you have any thoughts on the who should or shouldn't be on the call?
So a lot of times when I get involved, and Mark is correct, it depends on the size of the company. But as Mark said, with any kind of cyber response, the most precious commodity you have is your time and how you spend your time. So having legal counsel who understands cyber interacting with law enforcement frees up the C-suite to deal with working the problem. They may have to put together press releases or interact with customers. And so the more that they can focus on those types of problems and then have someone else work with law enforcement, it makes for a more coherent response, because the more that they have to do themselves, they're stretched in too many directions and the response can break down.
You're breaking down.
I know.
You're all
have
choked
a quick
up.
drink of water. I know.
It's very emotional.
So, yes. So, Mark, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question that is one that you and I always talk about, because one of the biggest reluctance of firms to engage with law enforcement is they believe that if I deal with the U.S. Secret Service or the FBI, that means immediately I'm going to get a call from my regulator, the FTC, HHS, pick your favorite regulator. Can you talk a little bit about that and the reality of it?
Sure. That basically is the question of what we won't do, right, during a cyber response. So let me just give you a few bullet points there that things we won't do. Number one, we don't go public or notify the press unless that's coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the victim's corporate legal counsel. There is a reason why we're called the Secret Service, right? Keeping the secret in the Secret Service. So we're not about making press announcements without a coordinated effort that's been approved by multiple parties. And we're not going to comment or share any information from any active investigation. So that's kind of the forefront main point. To your other comment, we are not a regulatory agency. Victims, may be required to contact regulators depending on their respective industry, but regardless of the regulator, coming to law enforcement is always going to be viewed as, in a criminal investigation and seen as positive. So we certainly encourage that. We don't share information outside of the law enforcement community, and we're going to work directly with, work with the IR firm to help with remediation that is going to be doing primary remediation support, but we're going to work directly with them. But to your point, again, we are not a regulatory agency. I have never in my 25 years even received a phone call from a regulator. That could happen, I guess, but it has not happened since I've been doing this.
So, Mark, I think where I'd like to turn next is I want to talk about threats, but I really want to focus a little bit in our conversation today on ransomware, some of the latest trends with ransomware. And then I think you and I will shift gears and talk a little bit about this most recent announcement from the Office of Foreign Asset Control and its impact on law enforcement. But could you share a little bit about the threats, particularly as it relates to ransomware as it currently stands?
Sure. So a big hot topic is the kind of the obviously COVID-19, right? And regarding ransomware and BECs. But I want to just kick off by saying we like to say that COVID-19 really didn't create new criminals, just new opportunities. They're still phishing. They're just using COVID bait. And they're still doing ransomware. They're just attacking via different, methods and vectors. So ransomware, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, in our pre-conversation, is that we in Atlanta are seeing more ransomware than business email compromise. It's kind of overtaken, if you will. And we're seeing ransomware kind of morph from just seizing, locking up computers and networks to actually now we're finding the bad actors are doing data exfiltration and posting the data on shaming sites to encourage payment, okay, which makes it a whole lot trickier, right? And not only that, but these adversaries are obfuscating, not to get too technical here, but they're obfuscating their command control traffic to make it more difficult to detect. So basically, the things that they're pushing out to their controlled servers are being hidden in an attempt to make it harder for us to detect and decipher. And they can do that via things like junk data and protocol traffic or stenography and et cetera. So it's morphed from just your traditional ransomware, freezing everything, making people pay a ransom, to really enticing people to pay the ransom by holding their data at ransom also. And it may not be a topic for this conversation, but during the whole pandemic, we've also seen a whole flood of SBA and PPE loan fraud, which our office is actually helping to investigate as well. So those are the big trends. And there's one more, and you want to talk about it a little bit, we can, but e-skimming, that's on, you go to your checkout on Amazon or a website and you put your credit card information in, and unbeknownst to you, there's a script running in the background by a bad actor who's collecting your credit card information from that website, and the consumer never knows it. It's called e-skimming. So we're seeing these kind of frauds happen, and that really is the new trend.
That's a good one to know. So, Mark, I want to kind of ask a more focused question. So there was a recent guidance that was provided by the Office of Foreign Asset Control, and it really related to ransomware. And in short, what it talked about was, hey, if you're going to pay the ransomware, which, Mark, you can talk about what law enforcement's position is on that. If you pay it to certain people who are on the OFAC excluded list, which are basically terrorists and people that the U.S. government doesn't want U.S. citizens doing business with, and you pay it and you didn't do your research and they're on that list, you can get prosecuted for money laundering. And there's some other parts of that ruling that have some real implications for law enforcement, because part of what the ruling talks about is there's a real incentive to be proactive about engaging law enforcement. So I'd love to get your perspective on what this latest ruling means for law enforcement.
Sure. So, Justin, as you said, OFAC stands for Office of Foreign Asset Control as part of the Treasury. Their advisory addressed victims of ransomware attacks, of the potential, sanctions or risks for facilitating ransomware payment, right, as you mentioned. Just a few points on that from my perspective. First, information that's shared with the Secret Service for any criminal investigative purpose is protected from being shared with regulators, to include OFAC. At the request of the victim and at our discretion, we can communicate publicly or with regulators this is the big if in our view there's been full cooperation in the criminal investigation, which means more than just a phone call, right? A couple other points. Number two, I would say the Secret Service doesn't generally investigate or enforce sanctions violations. We don't make a determination. You mentioned the SDA, that stands for Specifically Designated Nationals or Blocked Persons List. But we don't make a determination for entities considering to make payment that their counterparty is or is not on that list. That's for the victim to do, and they can go to the OFAC website and check to see if they are or are not on that list. Lastly, I would just say, I think the best advice is to have victim companies communicate directly with their specific regulators on the subject. The OFAC messaging hasn't changed our message. We don't encourage payment of ransoms. We understand it is a business decision if you do, and of course, if you do pay that, that's a business decision that you would make. But engaging law enforcement in that process is key, and I think it's written in the OFAC guidelines to showing the good faith that you worked with law enforcement. So, and again, our agents are not obligated to report anything to regulators. So hopefully that's helpful.
Well, it sounds like if I get a ransomware attack or a business email compromise, I really don't want one of these things. And there's quite a long list of challenges that can be associated with them, not to mention, criminal prosecution. So what would you recommend companies do to help on the prevention side, especially during this time where, as you had mentioned, there's just more opportunities, and they're really leveraging a kind of an emotional time right now. People are as they're trying to navigate both personal and in a business environment. Maybe people have been a little bit more lax on some of the controls and other items that they might have normally been doing. So I'd love to know what can listeners do to help prevent these types of things? Maybe some tangible tips.
Sure. first, I think the first thing that folks should consider is that there's a need to incorporate your cyber incident response plan. Well, obviously have one, but specifically addressing BECs and ransomware, but incorporate that into your business continuity plan. So what I mean by that is if the network goes down, how are you going to communicate? Do you have redundant communication, as I talked about earlier? Are the contact names for everybody that you would engage on your phone and on your network? Because if they are, chances are you're not going to be able to access them. So having hard copies available offline and offsite, ideally, to be able to reach out to people in a case of emergency is going to be really important. User education training is going to be obviously very key. People are the weakest link. They always have been and always will be. It certainly could be your untrained 18-year-old intern who clicks on that phishing email, right? So extra attention has to be given to folks like that, as well as the folks who have access and ability to wire and transfer funds. A couple of other key points, a few points are multi-factor authentication, strong passwords are key. I know folks are tired of hearing that, but the fact of the matter is there's been so many data breaches over the years with passwords stolen and with the tremendous amount of reuse of passwords. It's inevitable that some passwords are going to be able to be used for a banking or financial purpose. So having strong passwords, changing passwords, multi-factor authentication are huge. And if you're a victim, you got to reset both of those. Another key is patch. What I mean by patching is fixing the vulnerabilities that are identified by companies like this Microsoft. We've actually interviewed criminals that we've arrested who have said that they weekly would see what the vulnerability patches are, and that's where they would attack. And you would be amazed how many companies take sometimes too long or never make the patch for various different reasons. Maybe the patch wreaks havoc with their network or what have you, but patching is going to be very key. And then backing up, having backups that are not only offline, but air gap, meaning separate from the network. And here's one that people forget: test your backups. You'd be amazed how many people have backups, but they realize, you know what, we haven't actually tested the ability to do that. RDP, remote desktop protocol, is a vector for a lot of these bad actors to get into networks. So having RDP secured or disabled if you don't need it is key as well. I like to also suggest that there be a proactive component to this as well. Look at your executives, look at your CEOs, your CFO, your folks that are visible, and where are their email accounts published? A lot of people have social media, company websites, and that's a great place for actors to do some social engineering intelligence and use that for spear phishing attacks. And then lastly, I would suggest testing your plan. An untested plan is no plan, right? So doing a tabletop exercise of your incident management plan is key. And as I told Justin earlier today, we're more than happy to be invited to the table of a tabletop exercise to just kind of give the law enforcement perspective on what happens when a call takes place. We don't have to be there for the whole exercise. And as I mentioned many times before, please engage us before your hair's on fire. We like to have those conversations in a less stressful environment too. So just a few tips. Hope that helps.
Those are some great tips. So many tips, so many important nuggets. That I already forgot some of the follow-up questions that I had for you. I remember now. So Justin, one of the ones that he talked about was sending wires. And I know you have some very, very strong thoughts on what people should do before they send a wire. So I feel like you should share.
As I always say in every single cyber presentation I do, if they get one thing out of the hour or however long I blathered on, you never, ever, twice and 10 times on Sunday, ever send a wire because you got an email. You have to have some independent way of verifying the authenticity of that email to the point where you need to assume any email asking for money or to wire is false until you prove it authentic by some other means of further verification.
Thank you. Thank you. And then I think, Mark, the idea of testing your backup is one that I believe a lot of companies probably overlook. So very important nugget. I think we've all heard password and 2FA before. When we were all together earlier this year, I referenced that presentation all the time. But the idea for anyone listening is to test the backup, print the plan, and have an actual working simulation is very, very, very valuable advice. It is so much easier to think through all the holes that might come up or the issues or the who you call when you're able to think and not with your hair on fire when you call.
Sure. And Jody, just to add to that real quick, also your text messaging is kind of is the newest way that they're kind of trying to, people think that text messages oftentimes are just maybe more secure. I don't know. But if you get text messages that have any of those same kind of indicators, don't be clicking on links within text messages because it has the same effect, right? So, SMS messaging hygiene is just as important as, your computer hygiene and COVID hygiene.
So, Mark, before we get to the last two questions we ask all of our guests, I wanted to ask you one other question, and it's this. People don't realize, and I didn't truly realize this, but when you work with the Secret Service, you're working with some first-rate incident responders. There's a reason why the private sector loves to have former FBI and Secret Service personnel as part of their incident response team. So I'd just like you to share with the audience, what are the capabilities of the Secret Service? What do you do in the cyber realm and what don't you do? Because I don't want people to think, oh, I don't need an incident response firm. I'll just outsource that to the Secret Service. I pay taxes.
Sure. So first of all, we're not an IR firm, so it's not our role. But just to kind of back up and answer that question more thoroughly, our agent in charge, Steve Basil, and my supervisor, ASAIC, Malcolm Wiley, have given me a lot of latitude to assemble a great team. Many years ago, I learned the basic management lesson that the key to success in management is to ultimately surround yourself with good people, right? And so I definitely have been blessed to work with a good team in our Atlanta office. We have very competent individuals in the areas of network intrusion, mobile device and computer forensics. We're staffed with a network cyber analyst who helps in our investigative process. I have Alan Davis in our shop, who's our technical security advisor, who helps steer the ship, if you will, and works a lot with our task force officers across the state, who really are our force multipliers in our investigations. And we didn't really touch on that, but I wanted to hit this point. We're a small agency. We can't respond to everything. So we have utilized this task force concept and trained our local and state partners across the state of Georgia and really the United States in the areas of cybersecurity, forensics, and whatnot through our National Computer Forensic Institute, NCFI, in Hoover, Alabama. We send them through congressional funding to receive training and many pieces of equipment they can take back to their offices and departments and work their cases and also support our cases. So it's a great force multiplier, like I said, across the country. When in summary to all that, when you call a Secret Service office, you're going to get a response, or you can be assured you're going to get a response by a competent individual who is ultimately going to partner with you. And that's what we're all about, is partnership. It's your data. It's your network. You've invited us to the table, and we're here to kind of work through the incident together. To tie that last point that you mentioned, we are not an IR firm, so we don't do full mitigation. We're kind of like in the triage component of all that, right? So we work with those folks and your folks, but very fortunate, and I'm happy to also at the end here give some contact information for folks if they want to reach out to us.
Absolutely. So you gave so many incredible nuggets, and what we're asking all guests are to share what is kind of your favorite, your highly recommended privacy and security tip. And it can be, obviously you've shared a lot that companies can take. It can also be a personal one. So maybe something that you do, personally that you would highly recommend everyone do to protect their information as well.
Like, don't share your wife's password on the internet.
That's a great question, Jody. I think I've never been asked that. I think if I think about it for a second, I think my overarching, and it's kind of, answers all these issues, is slow down. slow down. The actors that are doing the ransomware, the business email compromise, and using phishing techniques, they are extremely crafty. They are targeting individuals, spear phishing, and hitting not only specific people, but the emails come at specific times of day, right? Friday afternoon or early Monday morning. They appear very genuine and will appeal to people's sense of urgency to kind of make you feel like, oh my gosh, I've got to do this right now. And so people, I think, to that point, will speed through an email and start clicking. And when you start clicking, that's when the havoc starts, right? So my number one tip, in addition to all the other things that we mentioned, I think the number one tip is going to be just slow down, do a search, check where that email is coming from, and if all else fails, pick up the phone and verify, as Justin, I think, said earlier. So, and I want to say thanks again for having me. Appreciate that.
Oh, absolutely. So now when you're not solving cybersecurity, ransomware and business email compromise cases, and you're not on podcasts providing all kinds of fabulous advice, what do you like to do in your personal time? Share a favorite hobby.
So I enjoy tennis. I enjoy sports with my kids. One unique fact is, or thing about me is, I'm a huge ice hockey fan, which you would not expect, I guess, from a southern person, at least here in Georgia. I have two boys that play ice hockey, and one who's actually playing up north right now, chasing his dream. So, and I have a wife and two dogs, and the second dog is a 9-week-old golden retriever. So we are a busy household.
It sounds like you are a very busy household.
So, Marc, we wanted to end by giving you the opportunity to provide your contact information, because I can't emphasize enough for our viewers that you need to have a pre-existing relationship with law enforcement. To Marc's point, calling them when your hair is on fire, you can do it, but it's not nearly as effective. So could you please share some information, and we'll also share it in our show notes so that people know how to proactively engage with United States Secret Service Cyber Fraud Task Force?
Absolutely. So if for the listeners that would be in the Metro Atlanta area, they can call our main number, 404-331-6111. That's 24/7. And if the answering service picks up, you can leave a contact message. For folks that are outside of Georgia, across the country, you can go to www.secretservice.gov. And within our main webpage, there's an investigative tab at the top. When you hit that, you'll find the ability to look up all the offices across the country that have cyber fraud task forces, and connect directly there. So that's just a couple of ways that folks can reach out.
Wonderful. Well, Marc, thank you again for sharing so much fabulous information. We really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes and check us out on LinkedIn. See you next time.